Welcome to this point-counterpoint session on whether artificial intelligence will transform the practice of anesthesiology. I'm Ron Pearl, a professor of anesthesiology, perioperative and pain medicine at Stanford University, and I've had the privilege of organizing and moderating this session. First, thank you all for staying here until the last session of the day. You've got a lot of commitment to education, and hopefully we'll make it worthwhile for you. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two speakers. It's a point-counterpoint session, which is sort of a nice name for a debate, but without winners or losers. I'll introduce both of them, then we'll sort of talk about how the session will run. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Hannah Lonsdale, Associate Professor of Anesthesiology at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Dr. Lonsdale completed medical school at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and then worked as an anesthesiologist in the United Kingdom until she moved to Johns Hopkins to study machine learning, artificial intelligence, data science, and wearable technology for perioperative management of children. She moved to Vanderbilt in the Division of Pediatric Anesthesiology in 2022. Dr. Lonsdale is supported by an NIH grant to explore AI applications in perioperative medicine. Dr. Lonsdale is the first author on this April's publication in Anesthesiology from the Anesthesia Research Council on strengthening discovery and application of artificial intelligence in anesthesiology. And she will be discussing or arguing that artificial intelligence will transform the practice of anesthesiology. Our other speaker will be Dr. Peter Killeran, who is Associate Professor of Anesthesiology and Biomedical Informatics at UT Health in Houston. In addition to his clinical practice, he's the Chief Medical Officer for the Memorial Hermann Health System. He completed medical school at Dartmouth, a residency at UT Health, and a fellowship in biomedical informatics. In 2014, he was in the first cohort of physicians who got board certified in clinical informatics. He's a former chair of the ASA Committee on Informatics and Information Technology, and in his current role as CMIO, he's responsible for implementing commercially available tools to support clinical and operational needs, including AI platforms, and he will be arguing that artificial intelligence will not transform the practice of anesthesiology. Both speakers will first get 20 minutes or up to 20 minutes each to argue their points, and then 5 minutes for a rebuttal in response to the points of the other speaker, and then we'll hopefully have about 15 minutes for you to ask questions and for discussion. So we'll go ahead and start off with, assuming we get the system to work well, with Dr. Lonsdale arguing that artificial intelligence will transform our specialty.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking around to come talk about AI with us all. Apparently, we don't have to put disclosures on our slides anymore, but it is now commonplace to put an AI disclosure when you have used generative AI in the creation of your material. Did I use AI to make this presentation? What do you think? Now, it's my job to argue that AI is going to revolutionize anesthesiology, and it will. But I also want to get real. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Clark Stanley. He was born in 1854 right here in Texas. He spent 11 years working as a cowboy and studied with a Hopi medicine man in Arizona. On his travels, he met some indentured Chinese railroad workers and learned how they used Chinese medicine to treat their aches and pains. In 1893, he developed a pain-destroying tonic offering instant relief for neuralgia, sciatica, lame back, lumbago, frostbites, chilblains, bruises, sore throats, and the bites of animals, insects, and reptiles. Any ideas? Snake oil. And nefarious marketing of snake oil led to the enactment of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. It defined national standards for drugs, which were tested by the Bureau of Chemistry in the US Department of Agriculture. That, in 1930, was renamed the Food and Drug Administration. But in Chinese medicine, the original snake oil is made from the Chinese water snake. That oil is rich in omega-3 fatty acids. It contains more than oily fish because snakes eat the fish and concentrate it. And audience members of an ICU or chronic pain persuasion are likely aware that the emerging role of omega-3 fatty acids can play in reducing inflammation and improving outcomes. So it took us over 100 years, but once we cut through all of the hype and the false claims, there truly is something at the core, even of snake oil, that can help patients. And you could draw a lot of parallels with AI. AI has a bit of an image problem at the moment. Every single one of these algorithms was developed with good intention, but things didn't quite go according to plan, often because they were used before they were ready. They hadn't been tested. The users weren't properly trained on the limitations. Perhaps the data sets were flawed, or no one really thought about the ethics of what they were doing. And in medicine at the moment, AI often feels like the scene from Monty Python, where a laboring woman in great pain is ignored by the clinical team as they drag in more and more complex and elaborate equipment that has no clear purpose. The surgeon requests that the team get the most expensive machine, and the hospital administrator praises the surgeon for using the machine that goes ping. AI in anesthesiology is deep in the trough of disillusionment as described by the Gartner hype cycle. Initially, a breakthrough innovation trigger leads to excitement, but no effective applications exist. And so, despite continued publicity, development doesn't meet expectations, and so attitudes harden. Slowly, though, the technology matures and we start to see greater benefit. And eventually, mainstream adoption takes off where broad applicability and relevance are evident and guidelines for assessing viability are clearly defined. And eventually, ideas graduate from this hype cycle as mature technologies. And recent attitudes are an interesting mix of AI is so funny, look, it can't do anything useful. And AI is coming for my soul, my job, and my humanity. So far in anesthesiology, most publications have reported on what is critical foundation work to establish techniques that will, in time, answer clinically important questions. But those current models lack robust validation, rigorous data handling, thorough risk assessment, or even sometimes justification for the use of AI over more traditional and appropriate biostatistical techniques. And all of those things will be necessary for us to even get a model that is ready for clinical application. And there's a well-described process for development of predictive clinical models, whether AI or otherwise. And it's similar to the development process for new medicines. Initial development is like laboratory work, drug discovery. We then move on to validation and calibration, which matches in vitro or animal trials where the new model is tested for its performance with data from new patient populations, perhaps from a prospective time period or a different hospital, to see if the model has generalizability. That is, it can maintain its performance on new sets of data beyond the data it was trained on. If our model validates well, we move on to impact studies. And they're like phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, the first use with human patients. They provide information on the intervention's ability to influence physician actions or change short-term or proxy outcomes. And then finally, we move on to implementation. They're like phase 3 drug trials, and they determine the effects on patient-centered outcomes. There is also a type of phase 4 monitoring for AI models, a post-implementation monitoring. So where are we in this journey with AI in anesthesiology? Last year, I presented this data. It's from a systematic review that studied models that were published between 2020 and 2023. It used a PRISMA protocol and a PROBAS assessment to evaluate risk of bias. And it found that primarily models were single-center initial developments, about 75%. Only 13% were externally validated across multiple centers. A further 13 were those early use in humans impact studies that look at the change in physician behavior and patient-related factors, but not a single study reported implementation. However, AI is a fast-moving field, and data from 2 years ago is pretty old now. So I wanted to update this for you. I took the search strategy that the authors of the review used in 2023 when they got 9,856 hits. I copy-pasted it into PubMed, limited it just to the dates after that study's cutoff. Much as I'm really dedicated to giving you as much information as I can't go through over 250,000 papers. So I used a more conservative strategy. And I came up with about, what have we got there? 40 or 50. So proportionally, you can see seems a big improvement in validation and calibration. But since that study was published in 2023, what brand new AI-related thing was introduced to the world in 2022, just before publication? ChatGPT, I can hear people whispering. So studies using large language models for, let's see if ChatGPT can make an anesthesia plan for me, or let's see if ChatGPT can pass the anesthesia boards. They count as validation studies, even though ChatGPT was not developed specifically for use in anesthesiology. And that accounted for 10 of these 15 validation and calibration studies. If we remove those and focus on models developed specifically for anesthesiology, there is still a proportional improvement, but it isn't quite as impressive. There were more impact studies there's 4, but 2 declared industry-sponsored conflicts of interest. And then finally, we have an implementation study, a randomized controlled trial, no less, which didn't find any benefit over standard care. So last year, I reported that progress for AI in anesthesiology was about here. I'm happy to report that the needle has moved, even if it's just a little bit. But you know, testing, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, so when you're really eager, you've got this really cool model that you want to start using, it's tempting to just skip over these steps and go straight for implementation. Let me just remind you what happens when we move fast and break stuff. So how does anesthesiology compare to other specialties in its AI work? When compared to specialties like radiology and oncology that have huge volumes of data, like image data or genomic data, there's a big publication deficit. And this difference stems not just from the type of and availability of data, but also availability of funding and pipelines for physician scientists and researchers. It was already hard enough to find clinicians who understood anesthesiology and the techniques for developing AI-based tools, but now we need clinicians who understand anesthesiology and AI model development and who have the knowledge of human factors and implementation science required to get these models to work in the OR. And that's another reason why we aren't yet seeing more AI in clinical practice. Also, many of the published studies don't give answers to clinically important questions. I have a quote from Justin Dimmick, the chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of Michigan. He says, when it comes to improving quality, there are the problem-first people, and then there are the data-first people. And I do informatics. I think, oh, I want to be a data-first person. But, he continues, the data-first people push massive data collection without first thinking, what am I trying to fix? So, what are the big problems in your hospital? Or does every day go super smoothly for you and your patients? For me, I think all day long I look at this, but perhaps also this as well, and simultaneously this, and this, and this. Who loves their EHR? What? No hands. And with good reason. The system usability scale is an industry standard. It's a short, simple, and reliable measurement of how easy it is to use various technologies. 70 to 100 is acceptable, 50 to 60, 50 to 70 is marginal, and less than 50 is not acceptable. Guess what electronic health records scored? And this was assessed by a sample of physicians across all specialty disciplines. Patients coming to the OR are getting more and more sick and complex. The decision-making needed for safe, intraoperative patient care relies on interpreting multiple simultaneous data channels, and that frequently exceeds the capacity of the human brain. Working memory, which is used in language comprehension and problem solving, can only retain 3 to 5 chunks of information at any one time. Who thinks they're good at multitasking? You just can't. A study shows that people who most frequently multitask may be those who are least cognitively equipped to effectively carry out multiple tasks simultaneously. And then there's this teeny problem. So completely unsurprisingly, we're all overwhelmed with the amount of data and the amount of work we have to do. And that's why I'm here arguing that AI will transform our practice. We're trying our best, but all of this overwhelm has impact on patients. Estimates vary, but around 50% of patients still experience moderate to severe postoperative pain. Chronic post-surgical pain occurs in 12% of ambulatory surgeries. The rate of postoperative nausea and vomiting in a recent study was 17%, despite almost complete adherence to the standard protocols. And patients with lower socioeconomic status are less likely to receive antiemetics, as are patients of color. And here's a meta-analysis of complications in hospitalized patients. The pooled rate of preventable mortality is 3.1%, and in the US, that's over 20,000 preventable deaths every year. So a lot of our perioperative and critical care decision-making is flawed due to things like cognitive bias, cognitive overload, and differing perspectives. Standardization of care has helped, but patients don't come in one-size-fits-all shape. And we have capacity to do better. AI hasn't yet changed the future of our specialty, but that doesn't mean it won't. We need to ask it to work on the really difficult problems, then rigorously test the results, and thoughtfully study the best way to successfully implement the highest performers. The best and most useful AI-based decision support tools need to fulfill these 5 rights of decision support. And what that looks like is going to vary based on the function of the tool, but the important thing is we're focused on meeting clinical need. And we need to think about that up front, or we'll develop solutions that no one wants or will need. And all of this careful and safe development work takes time, but we are making a good start. I'm not putting this up for you to read in detail, but you can see there's a lot of work going on, and this is just the start of the potential of AI in anesthesiology. So with the last few minutes, let's just take a little look at some of the AI-based tools that you might already be seeing in your OR. You probably can take a look at them in the exhibit hall. There's a really nice systematic review from 2 years ago now that looked at randomized controlled trials for ML-driven perioperative interventions. It only found 13 randomized controlled trials, and they only assessed 3 different tools. 6 of those studies had industry-sponsored conflicts of interest. And since that 2024 study, I found 3 more RCTs. Here's 2 of the tools. One is the hypotension prediction index. There were 8 studies, and the other is the nociception level indicator, 7 studies. Both are FDA approved, and they generate a dimensionless number between 0 and 100. They are what's known as human-in-the-loop decision support devices. They give you more information to help you make decisions about how to treat your patients. So the hypotension prediction index showed some really interesting and exciting early results with a significant reduction in intraoperative hypotensive events. But an RCT recently published of over 900 patients across 28 hospitals was that one I already described. It showed no improvement over standard care in incidence of moderate to severe AKI within the first 7 days after surgery. For the nociception level index, early significant differences in opioid consumption versus standard care have been reported, but nociception level index guided groups did not have significantly lower mean pain scores in the PACU. And currently, these are also standalone monitors, which is just another screen to look at that may increase your cognitive load. Another interesting device that is FDA approved identifies anatomical structures on ultrasound images in real time, and it helps you figure out your planning, although it is not yet approved, to the best of my knowledge, for use during needling. It has been tested in educational settings and on simulated patients. But I doubt that any of these early real-life applications are going to convince you that AI is going to revolutionize our specialty. So how can I stand up here and argue it's going to be transformative? Because who has a smartphone in their pocket? Who has a smartwatch on their wrist? In everyday life, the worldwide appetite for AI proceeds unabated, which is contrary to medicine's cautious approach. Who uses ChatGPT? I see most hands. I think it's great. What do patients think about us using AI? In a recent survey, 60% expressed discomfort with clinicians relying on AI. But even I don't want to rely on AI. I want to use it to help me to make better decisions. That human-in-the-loop idea. Patients are open to AI for clinical decision support for things like imaging, surgical planning, complication alerts, and even partially autonomous surgery. Anyone who's done a robot case, just imagine how much longer that's going to take when AI is doing it. How about what physicians think? The AMA surveyed physicians across many specialties, over 1,000, and 65% see an advantage to AI. 38% use it in their current practice, although, as you can see from that list, mostly it's not direct clinical decision support. It's for things like documentation and translation. And I saw that 35% think that clinical evidence is the most helpful resource to improve adoption. If only 35% want clinical evidence, what do the rest of the people want? But I looked at it, and it's actually, they want education. They want support to implement. They want case studies. They want to be able to ask questions. And they need defined best practices and guidelines. They're all works in progress. Who here uses AI directly in their clinical practice? Hey, nice. So one of the ways I regularly use AI, which pretty much anyone can do, is for literature searches. There are multiple options for this. Consensus is just one. You type in a question, and it will summarize the entire body of published literature for you in seconds. So, sorry, Peter, here's the answer. Yes, AI is poised to transform anesthesiology. And I couldn't have said this better myself, but that is actually because some of the papers it cites are my papers. And I'm also not sure that the AI doesn't have a vested interest in giving me this answer itself anyway. In conclusion, AI is here, it's in our pockets, it's on our wrists. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. I didn't intend this, but this does look a little bit like Peter. What we can, must, and should do is ensure that the AI we adopt in our specialty is developed to safely solve real-world clinical problems. Problems that are common, that are correctable with intervention. Things like preventable deaths, persistent pain, miserable nausea, and the global workforce crisis. Once developed, we need to extensively validate and test and thoughtfully integrate. 15 or 20 years ago, many anesthesiologists were talking about perioperative ultrasound in the same way that some people talk about AI today. It's completely unnecessary, doesn't add value, not needed, slows everything down. But now, ultrasound is pretty indispensable. It's opened new and safer ways to relieve pain, gain vascular access, and diagnose life-threatening perioperative problems. And it might sometimes feel that AI is just digital snake oil, but I hope that, unlike snake oil, it doesn't take us over 100 years to shed that skin of hype, regulate safe use, and find that clinically effective core. Thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon. Sorry to be the thing that's standing between you and the rest of your evening. So to get started here, I can figure out how to make it go forward. Okay, great. I have no disclosures. I actually didn't realize we didn't have to put the slide in anymore, but I will say I did use AI, and I'm going to call out those examples as I display them in my talk here. So we see a lot of headlines about the use of AI in healthcare today. There's a lot of hype, a lot of excitement, but also a lot of red flags and concerns. Personally, I'm very excited to incorporate artificial intelligence tools into my own practice, and I think we can do it safely and at scale. But today, my job is to argue the counterpoint here. And I think it's actually the much easier side to take, because it's always easier to be a critic and stick with the status quo. So, as I said, full disclosure, I did use several different generative AI tools. Some of the content of my presentation is going to be exclusively that. But I did so only after I developed my talking points and argument. So with that, I'll start with my first use of generative AI. I plugged in the prompt for this session into it to see what it would say. So I asked, why will artificial intelligence not transform anesthesiology? And I'm happy to say it was pretty well aligned with my own thoughts. While AI is expected to transform some aspects of medicine, it may not transform anesthesiology. Sorry. It made 5 points, and I agree with all of them. I'm going to make some additional points, but I will also surface those throughout my presentation where they align. So, number 1. Anesthesia care is too complex and too fast-paced to be replicated. Second, patient responses to anesthesia are too variable for AI models to accurately predict individual outcomes, with an emphasis on individual. Anesthesia providers are unlikely to fully delegate decision-making to AI systems without accountability for the performance of those systems. Fourth, medical data is notoriously low quality, which limits the ability to train models accurately. And 5, human interaction are critical and not easily replaced by artificial intelligence platforms. So as I previously mentioned, I'm going to incorporate these points into the rest of my talk. Wherever you see the little OpenAI symbol, it means it is a conclusion that came from ChatGPT, and you'll see how it aligns with my own thoughts. So here's the ChatGPT summary, its conclusion, which I agree with. AI tools are best thought of as a way to augment our performance, not to replace it. So back to the specific question we're here to debate. Will AI transform the practice of anesthesiology? And my simple answer is no. New technology isn't new. We've been doing this for a long time. We've been incorporating technology into our practice for a whole century or even more. This is going to follow the same trajectory as many other technologies that have come before us, or before this. Also, AI techniques have inherent shortcomings that put a ceiling on their scope of penetration into our practice. Statistical and empirical approaches on complex systems have limits, and AI is no exception to that. Third, AI is not consistent with patient-centered care. AI will never replace the human connection we create with patients when we earn their trust to keep them safe. So I'm going to pause here for just a second and set some expectations about my own perspective on this. This session is about educating ourselves about AI, its risks and benefits, so that we can effectively utilize it. I'm coming to this with a technical background. I did used to develop software professionally, but I'm not currently involved in AI research directly or developing an AI system of my own. Instead, I'm coming from the perspective of someone who has to argue for the value of a system like this and then implement it in a way that's helpful. And it's from that perspective that I say this is just another technology, and it's not going to be truly transformational. With that said, let's start with what was once a new technology that you're all familiar with, the development of the modern anesthesia machine that we have today. This is a story of continuous incremental improvement. Technological innovations in machine design have made AI much safer. Changes in technology have then enabled changes in technique. Our modern practice would not be possible without the ability to measure gas flows, to precisely control drug delivery, utilize positive pressure ventilation. This progression was not always linear, but it has moved us forward. And I expect these innovations to keep coming in our machine design, as they have for a century, but without formally or fundamentally transforming our practice. So I'm going to argue here that AI is going to follow a similar iterative trajectory. A pace of innovation may be different. It may take months or years instead of decades or a whole century to see those benefits. But embrace of technological innovation is not new for us, and it will not transform our core mission of keeping patients safe. So let's look at another historical example where a new device has played a central role in changing our practice. Pulse oximetry first became available in 1980, and it was rapidly adopted by the anesthesia community and became a standard of care in 1989. So as a reminder for how it works, it measures the absorption of two beams of light, one red, the other infrared, as it passes through tissue. Because absorption of infrared light by hemoglobin is proportional to its oxygen saturation, it's possible to non-invasively infer O2 saturation by correlating values with a reference population where both measured and inferred values were known to create a correlation matrix. Now, I'm not an expert on the details for how that all works, and that's not the point here. In reality, it's a much more complex process than what I just alluded to. But my point is that pulse oximetry is using measurements from a clinical device in real time and using correlation of that data to a reference population to infer a useful value. Put another way, the resulting value is a prediction of the true oxygen saturation if it could be directly measured. So using data correlation to infer values and make a prediction is nothing new for us. Okay, so why is this relevant to AI? The details of how the prediction is made by an AI algorithm may differ significantly from the calibration studies I just described for pulse oximetry, but the process is similar when you're training an AI model to make predictions. In the case of pulse oximetry, there were long-standing concerns that skin pigments would affect absorption of light, and that calibration studies were primarily performed on individuals with light skin tones and may not be applicable to the population at large. During the COVID pandemic, this became a very hot topic as O2 saturation was used to rate the severity of illness and guide escalation of treatment. Validation studies, like the one I'm showing here from the New England Journal, have since demonstrated that there are systematic differences in saturation across different populations, and this undoubtedly restricted care from some populations and likely caused harm. And so I'm not here to tell that particular story, though it's a very interesting one. My point is that clinicians have to know how AI tools are trained to know whether they are appropriate to use on the specific patient that's sitting in front of you, because it may differ significantly from the training population. Again, this concept is not particularly new. Evidence-based medicine suffers from the same challenge. When deciding whether to apply evidence from a randomized controlled trial to the patient that's sitting in front of you, we're all taught to ask whether the patient is similar to the study population. So that's limitation number one, bias. Now, let's look at some of the limitations of large language models like ChatGPT when we apply them to medicine. So I'm going to start with some peril by reviewing at a very high level how ChatGPT works. And this is straight from their documentation on the web from the topic that's titled, "What is ChatGPT and how does it work?" So LLMs are trained on a set of documents, usually scraped from the internet, to identify and learn the different elements that are contained within them and identify the relationships that connect them with each other. For text, those elements are words, and for images, it's groups of pixels. In the case of text, we know words tend to follow familiar patterns that form phrases and sentences in regular and predictable patterns. These relationships can be captured and used to predict a response, one word at a time. From this, we can conclude that LLMs are inherently statistical models, very complex, sophisticated, hyperdimensional statistical models that go far beyond a simple normal distribution curve. But at a high level, they use statistical relationships from a reference data set to select the most probable next word. The likelihood of getting that word right in a prediction is constrained by all the same familiar statistical principles. So models can improve by analyzing more relationships, looking at more words, more phrases, and sentences that are further and further apart from each other in the document. Early in the training process, as the model is identifying these new elements and relationships, if tasked with completing a simple sentence like, instead of turning left, she turned blank, the chosen word might be relatively random. It doesn't have enough information to make an accurate prediction. However, as relationships are developed and the model gets bigger and more complicated, predictions get better and more plausible. Thinking more generally about what we know about statistics, this makes intuitive sense. The more observations and variables you have to build a statistical model, the better the prediction is going to be. However, there is a limit to the accuracy of any prediction made using a statistical technique. There are multiple ways to complete the phrase in this example, and there's an inherent degree of randomness for which solution you select. In addition, we all know about false positive and false negatives, observations that unexpectedly fall either outside or within a distribution. There's another inherent risk of any statistical technique. When applied to a complex system with complex features such as nonlinear relationships, feedback loops, and critical transitions, much like a patient's physiology who's undergoing surgery, you can see how a purely statistical approach can have limited accuracy and can be very difficult to generalize to other situations. So I think the ChatGPT summary of this makes the point well. The diverse and unpredictable nature of patient response limits the ability of AI models trained on existing data to accurately predict individual outcomes. So just a little bit more on the ability to accurately predict individual outcomes. In a statistical model, predicting the central tendency for a population is not the same thing as predicting an individual value. Individuals are not the same thing as a population of one. Let's take the example of a population of colored tiles that are a mix of two colors, green and blue, taken from, say, a sales catalog. We have a group of 10 examples with varying combination of those colors that are evenly distributed across the spectrum, from 5% blue and 95% green to 95% blue and 5% green, with an interval of 10% change in saturation between each. The average value for this population is 50-50, but note that the average doesn't represent any individual in the actual sample. Now, had we chosen the median, we wouldn't have had that problem. But for argument's sake, let's say we're making the assumption that all these variables are continuous. If we now want to know which tiles are most popular, we would need to look at a distribution of color choices. Say, what tiles are selling the best? Let's assume we find a population that follows a normal distribution. Knowing this distribution, we can more confidently predict which tiles are typically selected, something that might be useful for, say, managing an inventory. We could say with confidence that of the next 100 customers, about 68% or 68 of them would select a tile with a color saturation between 45 and 55%, one standard deviation from the mean in this distribution. Rationally, if asked to predict the next tile, I would pick a value in that range because they are most frequently selected, and I would be right 68.2% of the time, more often than not. The problem here is when we need to make only one prediction. In this case, what's the color of the next tile? In the case of an LLM, what's the next word? Individual predictions are not 68.2% correct. They are either correct or incorrect. As I already mentioned, adding more variables and more observations can help improve the probability of accuracy, but there's an inherent error rate. This kind of approach favors the central tendency by favoring what's most likely, even if it is a multi-dimensional average. So to illustrate how a generative AI system can favor central tendency and yield something pretty unrealistic, I'm going to show some examples using Google Gemini. In this case, I gave the prompt, create an image showing typical vital signs during surgery. You see the result. At a distance, it looks great. Pretty amazing that that can be pulled up so quickly. However, when you look at a little bit more closely, you see that none of the details are actually right. The EKG is pretty close. It's got an extra squiggle or two in there, but there are two SpO2 curves that don't look like SpO2 curves. The generated image is essentially a visual average that captures all the high-level features of a monitor, but it doesn't represent what a realistic case might look like. It doesn't represent any individual in the population. Giving a different prompt, create an image showing typical trends in vital signs during surgery, it generates an image that's a little less plausible. It doesn't look like anything that I would ever use. It also has some problems with the blood pressure, presumably the systolic and diastolic values inverting and crossing. So that's our first hint that we're into the land of nonsense. But it's really when you look at the axes on the scales here that you see the real nonsense. So the model knows to visually predict that numbers belong on an axis next to the waveform, but it doesn't understand what those numbers are. It doesn't even really understand that they're numbers, only things that we interpret as looking like numbers. It can't use reasoning to know that they should follow a regular scale and not be repeated and be at a consistent interval. Generative AI is not designed to reason. It's only designed to know what's probable and what's likely to be adjacent. So now it's a fair critique of these examples to say models trained on a clinical data set would perform much better than ones trained on the internet, and that's absolutely true. But my point here is that AI models perform best on narrow use cases. To be accurate, you have to identify those use cases and then train them specifically to achieve acceptable results. To be accurate, there's simply too much diversity in patients to capture everything. It's essential to include reasoning into our decision-making, and that's what we do. That's what we add to this process. Narrowly scoped tools can be useful, but they're not going to transform our practice. Other issues that further limit AI accuracy: missing inaccurate data. We know that many records have inaccurate or missing data, or both, and you can see some statistics here that are pretty outrageous for the occurrence of those things. It's also true that things like nonverbal communication and visual cues, visual observations that we pick up as humans will never get recorded and thus are not accessible to an AI model. So these points GPT also summarized. Gaps in inaccuracies in data are a problem, as are challenges with incorporating into normal workflows, a subject which I'm not even addressing. Perhaps most importantly, human interactions are essential. People can respond to other people much better than a machine can. So anesthesia is an art and a science. We're often balancing opposing goals to meet patient needs that might require a deviation from a specific protocol or a best practice or what's normally done. A recent example of this from my own practice was taking care of a Jehovah's Witness who reluctantly agreed to use blood products under very specific and limited circumstances. Caring for such an individual requires a unique and individualized approach that's much better suited to reasoning rather than a generative AI tool that's only focused on probabilities. And I will also say I'd used Microsoft Copilot to create that goofy image. I did my best to make it a little bit better, but that was the best we could do of a sign of mixed messages. Again, GPT summarizes this well by acknowledging the importance of human judgment, intuition, and experience, and the difficulty in replacing that in an AI platform. I think there's something else to be said and learned from other attempts to use or efforts to use empirical and statistical approaches in medicine, specifically around evidence-based medicine. I mentioned this earlier when deciding whether to apply a recommendation from a randomized controlled trial to an individual patient. We're all taught to ask, is this patient similar to the study population? For an AI platform, we need to ask, was this patient included in the training data set? But we also need to ask whether the expected outcome is aligned with the patient's goals and needs. Unfortunately, the similarities with EBM may end there because there are radical differences in how the different techniques assess data quality and bias. Finally, we know overconfidence in technology can be disastrous. I'm going to share the example of the ASAUpdate2025, which is a computer-controlled radiation therapy machine introduced in 1982. Between 1985 and 1987, 6 reported accidents occurred that resulted in massive radiation doses that were attributed to programming defects where an unusual and very improbable but possible sequence of commands caused an overdose. Given the inherent challenges of bias and error associated with AI, would you want that kind of automation? Would you take responsibility for it as a clinician? If properly implemented, there's potential for this type of technology to augment performance, but it will remain supplemental to the practice, not transformative. To wrap up, AI is going to be useful. It's going to be utilized at increasing rates, but it's not going to transform what we do. We've been incorporating technology into our practice for over a century. Incorporating AI tools is going to follow a similar iterative pattern. AI uses statistical methods and is subject to the same limitations of any other statistical approach. Bias, error, data inaccuracy put a ceiling on how deeply it can be integrated. Finally, AI is not patient-centered. It can't reason to know the difference between what's correct and incorrect. It can't determine when deviation from what's normal is needed to align with patient wishes. Given the risk of over-automations, patients are likely to demand a human in the loop. So, P.S. AI is not free, although sometimes it feels like that. There are very large financial and environmental costs involved with running these technology platforms. It also takes significant amounts of processing time. While I would expect that the performance of models is going to continue to improve, they may never be good enough when seconds truly count. Equity and ethical issues also need to be considered here. Access to advanced technology is never evenly distributed, with low resource areas never seeing the same benefit, and that's an issue we need to grapple with. And finally, the elephant in the room that we already mentioned is that it's not the developer of the tool who's responsible for error, but the clinician using it. And that's going to really limit the acceptance of these kinds of platforms in regular use. So in conclusion, AI is not going to be transformational, and I think ChatGPT agrees. Thank you.
I go back to Ron's.
Oh, yeah,
moderator
I forgot the last step.
Time for my rebuttal. So the technologies Peter mentioned did transform anesthesiology. It likely felt incremental at the time, but by looking back, we can see how revolutionary things like the pulse ox, ultrasound, and the modern anesthesia machine were compared to the practice of 100 years ago. Peter mentioned bias. Most AI models are trained on real-world data. If we, as all clinicians, practice unbiased medicine, the models do not add bias. So we first need to fix ourselves, make sure we are not practicing biased medicine. But there are also tools to look for bias. And if you are aware that bias may exist in your AI tools, it's possible to account for that. Peter mentioned that patients and healthcare systems are complex, non-linear systems. And that's exactly where AI excels. Using models as clinical decision support leaves us in control of deciding whether we want to use the information they generate. They're not taking our jobs, they're just making our jobs easier. And yet, human interactions are better. I don't want the AI to go have the preoperative conversation with my parents. But I do want to be less overwhelmed. I want the AI to perhaps do those boring, tedious things like digging deeply into the patient's chart or responding to all those emails I get every day, to leave me with more time and more cognitive availability to spend on direct interaction with my patients, with residents, with coworkers. There's even now ambient AI, which will listen to your conversation with your patient. It's kind of like dictation, so it will produce a clinical note, not just that dictates exactly what you say, but it will produce a summary of what you say so that you can edit it, but it takes a lot less time than having to document in detail. And that is something that exists now. It's something that we are using at Vanderbilt. And finally, I'd like to use the analogy of the motor car when thinking about AI. So a motor car can literally be a black box. I don't know what's under the hood. I don't know how a modern car engine works. But I do know that I can use it safely to get from my house to the grocery store to work. I also know that I wouldn't use it to get from my lounge to my kitchen. And I wouldn't use it to drive to France, the one sorry. And the reason I know that my motor car is safe to use is for a whole bunch of safety reasons. There is safety regulation to make sure that the car, when it is produced, is safe to use. There is driver education. Everyone has to be licensed to use a motor car. There's federal or government regulations. There are strictly defined rules of the road. And we need all of these things to use AI safely in medicine so that we don't try to drive to France in our cars. And to continue the theme of cars, I think there's a really interesting attitude to AI and a lot of technology that is really reflected in autonomous vehicles. So whenever an autonomous vehicle gets in a wreck, has an accident, it makes national or international news. And we think, oh my goodness, these things are not safe. We can't possibly use them. But think about how many car accidents are caused every day by human drivers. I don't need my car to be perfectly safe. I just need it to be somewhat safer than a human behind the wheel. But somehow we don't really think about technology like that. And I found that interesting. That's kind of all I have to say, so I'll hand over to Peter.
I'm going to be brief. Hannah spent most of her talk mentioning that there was no evidence for benefit for AI tools. The bulk of her argument for why these are going to be transformational is based on snake oil, a future that doesn't exist yet, this fantasy that we're looking for, that technology is going to save us from ourselves. We both agree, actually, that this is good, impactful, useful technology. But is it transformational? That's really what we're kind of arguing here. Thus far, we've not seen evidence for showing a lot of benefit. It's very cool and engaging, and we enjoy it. Maybe that's a reason to do it, but is that going to transform our jobs? I'll argue no, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We'll take questions in a minute. Let me first thank our two speakers. Like everyone else, I similarly asked ChatGPT what it thought about, and has the potential to redefine anesthesiology by enhancing patient safety, improving efficiency, and supporting decision-making during perioperative care. While it's unlikely to replace the anesthesiologist, it will almost certainly reshape their roles and be useful for perioperative assessment, intraoperative monitoring, decision support, closed-loop anesthesia delivery, postoperative care and pain management, and operational and logistical efficacy. It then went on to say that the bottom line is it will transform anesthesiology, not by replacing anesthesiologists, but by redefining how they deliver safe, efficient, and personalized care. And I think that's consistent with what you've heard. And then added one more sentence, didn't ask it to do this at all, but in terms of what we're looking at, would you like me to format this into a short academic essay or review paper with citations, perhaps suitable for a medical journal or conference submission? So we are living in a different world than before. The pace is going quickly. Let me first do we have questions from the audience? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Yeah, there's one microphone.
Sorry. I think it was a great talk. One of the things that I've noticed is that the word AI sometimes is meaningless. It means different things to different people. And the way that you were talking about, the pro person was talking about AI, was that AI just involves all of advancement, all technology, includes better data procurement, better implementation science, better modeling, whereas the con was that AI is a strict definition that it's advanced statistical modeling. I think maybe, can you agree on what the definition of AI that you guys are talking about is?
I usually take the AMIA definition, which I don't have off the top of my head, but it's the American Medical Informatics Association, which is algorithms that are used to perform tasks associated with human-level intelligence. But yeah, it is, you are right, AI gets conflated, and apologies if I conflated it, with all kinds of things. And the definition has evolved, like since the 1960s, many things that we would now consider to be pretty dumb would have been considered AI in the past.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, the purpose of this panel is not really to have the debate and settle this question, but really, so it's really to have the conversation, and ultimately, it's how we define things, which makes it an argument that can be won or lost. What is the definition of transformational? What is the definition of artificial intelligence? So I don't think I can really improve upon that answer, but other than to agree that the technology, the terms get confused. I'm not sure any of us are. I think we're all pretty sloppy with how we use those terminologies. So it's a good call out. Thank you.
So one theme that came up was Adam Collins from Portland. One theme that came up was that I can relate to is, and probably everybody, is how overwhelming the amount of information is, or the amount of information relative to how much time we have to actually deal with it. So our workspaces are super complicated, and you showed that there's this huge proliferation of published data, and Dr. Pearl could use ChatGPT to add one publication while he's standing there if he wants. So it seems like isn't that one of the major roles where it can read infinitely fast and help digest and make things more usable? It's basically our user interface into a world that's too big and too complex for us to handle anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is well taken. There are two sides to this. One is areas where there's a lot of like summarization that can be done in the EMR. I think that's a huge opportunity. We can't read the whole chart, but an AI tool, if you have Epic, it's coming, can summarize all of it. It can even look into care everywhere, or at least that's on their roadmap to be able to do that. So you can see that entire patient's longitudinal record in seconds. That could be incredibly useful and time saving, perhaps maybe even transformational in how we do our pre-op assessment.
I win!
Again, the point is there's no winners and no losers. But then the flip side to that is if you think about devices in the OR and the complicated workspace you're saying, that is a place where we need simplification even more, and the proliferation of devices that work on narrow problems is another problem. So we have to look at total workflow, what's useful, and I think we have to be engaged with the developers of this technology to make sure they're doing things that are actually useful for us, not just cool. And there's a danger of that. So that's my response.
Yep, I agree. I think focusing on the clinical problem, yes, is the first thing we need to do, and it's something that we haven't so far been great at because we're just learning what these tools can do. But I have great hope that
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Matt Danley from Austin. I just want to thank you both. That was phenomenal. And I think, Dr. Killeran, I think you firmly convinced me that LLM, usage is probably not the best thing in medicine. But and you already alluded to a lot of what I was going to ask with your last comment. So thank you, whoever asked that last question. I think the one thing I want to ask you, just to put your look into your silver ball in the future and tell me what you think, is I equate a lot of this to thinking about, is my job going to be commoditized? And we relate a lot of this to, we all love aviation, to compare our jobs to what pilots do. And the reason why I still think we have two pilots in an airplane is because we're paying for their judgment, not because they can turn a switch, but because if seconds count, I want someone there that can actually do something and fix the machine. But the machine can also, we have Cirrus aircraft with safe return that can land themselves. We have auto takeoff, autopilot, and pretty much every commercial airliner nowadays. So I would say it would be transformational to have anesthesia autopilot for the intraoperative phase, which we know is the safest phase of anesthetic care. And I'm wondering if you guys see that in the horizon and when you think that is, and would that be transformational?
Thanks for the question. There are in development, and have been for quite some time, automated closed-loop anesthesia delivery systems. I don't think the FDA is going to approve them anytime soon, although I think there is a movement towards kind of making those initial conversations happen. But yeah, I think it's that kind of thing is going to be far into the future because, as we say, there are rare use cases where it's not going to make the best decisions, and somewhat like the aviation industry, which has had its problems with AI, to put them mildly. Planes have crashed because people don't understand the limitations of AI-based technologies. So I think the safety testing for that is going to have to be extremely in-depth before we are ready to use it as a specialty.
I think there are the question you raise about workforce questions and being replaced, I think are very good. I don't think any of that's happening anytime soon. I don't think we are going to have airplanes flying with only one pilot anytime soon, but I could imagine a world in the future where we do only have one pilot instead of two. I could easily see that happening. I think I could see changes in the anesthesia workforce where you might have higher staffing ratios or lower, less qualified, for lack of a better word, less trained technicians monitoring a device rather than a CRNA or an AA sitting there. I could see those changes coming someday, but I think it's a long way off.
I think it's we should differentiate two things. One is AI autonomously running what's going on, but said multiple times here is when seconds count. In many settings now, AI is able to predict many minutes before a problem actually occurs that there's going to be a problem with. We're talking about the hypotension prediction index, a respiratory problem, et cetera. It can suggest what possible etiologies are to the person. I think we'll still have someone there to decide whether it's accurate and to implement them. But I think we will get to where we rely much more on AI, its ability to predict that there is a problem developing when we are often not aware that that's happening. And I do critical care in lots of settings. Sepsis is predicted hours in advance of whenever anyone recognizes it. Also, AI is always vigilant. And, that's the model of ASA. And maybe you are, but I can tell you that there's lots of times in the OR that I'm not all that vigilant to every second. We'll take two more questions, and then unfortunately we're going to run over time.
Hi, thank you so much. Maxime Alouche from France. I really like the analogy of driver education, where you have to, not many people learn how to drive by themselves, right? But with AI, we're all given these tools that we have to use, and we have to learn how to prompt. I wonder, I think you're all faculty, so how you think about educating or maybe changing the way we're training our residents, our medical students. Maybe should there be an exam on how do you use AI in your practice? And so I'm interested in learning how you think about this.
I mean, it's a great question. I would say in my own job, I'm not in a education curriculum development mode, but I think it's a great point, and I think we should be educating all of our trainees on it. I think they do need to understand things about like how bias impacts these things. The analogy I draw is with evidence-based medicine, as I mentioned here. We were all taught that as a standard curriculum in medical school, how to interpret the results of a randomized controlled trial, all those kinds of things to think in a structured way about it. I think we need a similar type of curriculum introduced in the very beginning of medical school that carries throughout all of our training, and we need to be continuously reminded of it throughout training, CME, et cetera, to make sure we are maintaining our awareness of how these tools are impacting our practice. So it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a great specific answer for how to do that, but it's definitely needed.
I'm surprised you didn't mention this, Peter. The Committee on Informatics and Information Technology is currently developing an AI curriculum that will be available through the ASA that will help clinicians to understand more about AI. So it's coming.
Thank you.
My name is Denisa Pruitt. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama. He touched about education. I'm going to talk about legislation. As these things keep invading our instruments, and they might increase the amount of bias much more than in other cases because of the amount of data used for the deductions that these machines do. Is there any legislation or attempt of legislation, I'm not going to say legislation, attempt of legislation in which these things are uncovered for us before that is in an instrument? Which instruments are we using that has AI or not? There's no labels. You go to an instrument, you trust that it works like that. But since the bias can be exponentially increased, have we done anything about that? And that's now. I'm not thinking about 10 or 30 years or when everyone over here might be retired.
Yeah, thanks for the question. There's a lot to unpack there. One thing that I found really interesting was a proposal that, like we have a drug fax or a drug label on all of the medications we use, even if we don't really look at them, that AI-based tools have a similar like model fax sheet that tells you how the model was trained, what the limitations are, and kind of a warning of how to use it. In terms of bias, there is no legislation, as far as I'm aware, for bias mitigation. I think it's up to us as developers and clinicians to investigate to make sure that we minimize the impact of bias. I'd like to hope by getting large data sets that makes it less likely rather than more likely. But as I mentioned, we train things with real-world data, so those baked-in biases from clinical practice will transfer unless we look for them and mitigate those. Does that answer your question?
We work with surgeons. Their decisions are often very much based on bias, whatever that last complication was, et cetera. And so I think as we talked about, the issue is going to be much more not simply are there problems, but to what extent are they better or worse than when we don't use it. I want to thank Drs. Lonsdale and Killoran for their insights into all of this, and you for being such a great audience, being now after 5 o'clock. And leave you, large language models are really sort of amazing to me. This was asking ChatGTP to write I can't advance my slides here. There we go. An ode to artificial intelligence and anesthesiology, and the language is just beautiful in many ways, has lots of insights and ideas about anesthesiology and how AI can do it, and it just reads well. There's actually, it's so long, I only threw 4 paragraphs up there, but there are some amazing things that AI is up to nowadays. So thank you for being such a great audience. Enjoy the evening.